one of the things that I've realized is that what we worship is very revealing, right? And we all worship something or someone. As I was studying for this, I realized that, some of the things that I actually worship in life aren't God. They're actually, when it comes down to it, it's pretty much I worship myself and my pleasures and the things that I, would like, my desires, my wants. And it was a tough one to have to evaluate my life. And what I would ask you to do today is ask God to reveal to you today what you are worshiping or who you are worshiping, and if there's something that needs to change in your worship, and that you would see what it is revealing in your life. What is what you are worshiping revealing about who you are and your character? But if I'm going to ask you to do that, we need to really define what worship is, don't we? So I thought I'll be kind of wise, and I'll look up on dictionary.com the definition of worship, right? Because we all know it's on the internet, therefore it must be true. Why are you laughing? But according to dictionary.com, worship means to render religious reverence and pay homage to. That's according to dictionary.com. Interesting to me that it's tied with religious reverence, right? But let's throw out that for a moment, because that's the internet's definition. Now let's go to what the Bible defines about worship. When you're studying the Bible, there's this principle that we're to hold on to, and it's called the law of first mention. And what it means is this: whenever you come to a word in the Bible, what you need to do is find out when it was first mentioned, and that defines the definition through the entire Bible. Now, the word worship is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 22 in reference to Abraham sacrificing Isaac. You know, the story goes that God told him to sacrifice his son, his only son, so he got up early and they're going, and Isaac's like, hey, Dad, I see everything, but where's the sacrifice? And that's when, the King James, I believe, gets it best when Abraham answers him. He says, son, God will provide himself the sacrifice, pointing us to Jesus. But as they get to the base of that mountain, he looks to his servants, to the people that are with him, and he says this: we will go and we will worship and we will return. And that's the first mention of the word worship. And what it's in reference to is a lifestyle lived in obedience to God, the God of the Bible, the great I am. It wasn't a religious reference or reverence, or it wasn't paying homage to. It was an act of obedience. It was a life lived in worship. It's a lifestyle, not an activity. And the problem is oftentimes we limit worship to an activity done on Sunday morning or in the car when we pop in that CD driving to point A to point B. And then once we get out of that car or we leave church, we believe that my time of worship is done. When in reality, it's when we get out of that car that our life of worship really begins. When we leave the church doors, that's when this life of worship really takes place. And we all worship something or someone. And most of the time, our worship is given without even realizing what we're worshiping. Right? Well, how will you know what you are worshiping? It's actually quite simple. You will know what you worship whenever that object is removed, how you respond to it. Right? When you're not getting what you think you need as God, your own God, right? How do you respond to that? The question we need to ask is, how will I worship and serve God when I don't get the life that I want? Because that's what we're going to see here as we begin to look at chapter 3 and look at how Nebuchadnezzar built this image and he asked the children of Israel to bow down to it. And these children who weren't living the life that they thought they were going to live because they were brought into exile wasn't what they grew up thinking they wanted to become. But yet it was still a life that they were living. You see, none of us will get the total life we were all hoping for, will we? Life is full of disappointments. It's full of us not getting what we want. And so today what we're going to look at is how we can remain loyal to the Lord in our times of disappointments as we look at what is revealed through our worship. And the first thing that we're going to see in the first 7 verses of chapter 3 of Daniel is that what we worship really reveals our heart, right? And what we're going to look at 3 different hearts here. We're going to look at the king's heart, the people's heart, and the heart of the redeemed. And so in verse 1, we're going to see the heart of the counterfeit king and his kingdom. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width was 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura and in the province of Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to come to the dedication of the king's image which Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So the satraps, the judges, or the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. It's thought that 20 years has passed from the time that Nebuchadnezzar confessed that Daniel's God was the true and living God when Daniel gave him the interpretation of his dream. They're thinking that about 20 years has gone by. Then all of a sudden, the king forgot what he professed with his mouth. And then he builds this image, this big image. It was about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Think Washington Monument, right? Don't think statue. That's how big this thing was. And as this image shows us, what you can see is this. You can confess the Lord with your mouth, but not have him change your heart. And we know people that have done that. In chapter 2, only the head of the image was of gold, right, concerning the empire of Babylon. But here in chapter 3, what do we see? This whole image is of gold. It's funny, for whatever reason, everybody wants you guys to know this. The image itself was probably not all pure gold, because there probably would not be enough gold in Babylon to make the image that big of solid gold. So it was probably constructed of wood and overlaid in gold to give you the impression that this nation in this image was something so great. But isn't that really what our attempt of worship is? On the outside, it looks great. But on the inside, remember when you were a kid? Like, there's a couple things, 3 things that really impacted me as a kid. Number 1, Christmas time, when I would always get that little package of lifesavers, right? Where they had lifesavers on both sides. You can get that same package today, but they're tricky. They only give you half the amount of lifesavers. I like the butterscotch ones. It's kind of a guilty pleasure, but I like those. Then Easter time. Remember the See's Candy eggs that were that crystallized sugar that they had the little images on the inside? I don't know why I liked those, but I did. And then I remember the disappointment when I sank my teeth into my first Easter bunny that was chocolate, that I just assumed was going to be solid, and it was hollow. Brokenhearted. But that's what worship is like. That's, in essence, what this image is that we set up to worship if it's anything other than the God of the Bible. The God that shows himself faithful to us. It's a hollow Easter bunny, right? As he set this image up, what he is saying is, you know what, God, I know you said that my kingdom's going to fall, but I don't believe you. I want everybody to know that I'm establishing a kingdom of pure gold and that there's not going to be another empire to follow me because I'm going to be the greatest. Kind of scary, isn't it? But that's exactly what we say when we worship something or someone other than God. I'm going to establish my kingdom. I'm going to give my worship to something else. And I want people to know that, look what I'm doing. You see, when God isn't honored in a man's heart, he tends to glorify himself and tries to make everybody worship him. Isn't that the case? Isn't that what we've seen? How many images have we expected people to worship that we've set up in our life that reflect us? Wanting people to think that we are something that we are not. This king had many victories over many enemies, but all it led to was really a pride-filled heart and fear that he was going to lose everything that he worked so hard for. That's all it led to in this man. And so he sets up for himself an image, and he sets himself up as God and expects people to worship him as such. Now you're saying, well, we don't do that today. Well, think about it this. You know, we do worship like this. Even if we don't like to think so. We always want our needs met, and we want other people to see how good we are. The question is how do we worship the true and living God in seasons of oppression like these Hebrew children will? The first thing that we need to do is we need to remember only the real king knows and controls the future, and his name is Jesus. Number two, that everyone wants to be a king with a kingdom that they rule and control. If you don't believe me, just look at what we do, right? What do we try to do? We go to work and we try to control people. We go home and we try to control our situation. If none of those work, what do? We coach youth sports. And try to control 10-year-olds. Like, I've seen that time and time and time again. That's the one thing about youth sports that drove me nuts, is these guys that tried to live their lives vicariously through 10-year-olds. What are they doing? They're setting up images of themselves. If you would just be like me, we would win. That's what they say without saying it, right? The third thing that we see is that people who don't know God end up worshiping other people. If I just had what they had, everything would be okay. Now, this isn't the first time that we see things like this in the Bible, right? Interesting, we have the Tower of Babel, right? Which they were going to build this tower to reach heaven, to reach God. And God's like, oh, let me show up and shake things up a bit, right? You want to know what's interesting? That it's probably... This image was probably built in the same location as the Tower of Babel. I'm just glad God's people never build images like this. I mean, I'm glad that that's just something that the heathens do. Oh, how quickly have we forgotten the golden calf, right? But Moses, I just threw gold in and out came a cow. Really? Did Aaron really think Moses was going to buy that? Does that sound dumb to anybody else? It's like your kids giving you an excuse of how they didn't eat the cookie in the cookie jars. They have the chocolate around their face. Like, you throw gold in, cows don't just pop up. So we see that. We saw the heart of the king, the counterfeit king in his kingdom. And now what we're going to look at in verses 5 through 7 is we're going to look at the heart of the people and their counterfeit worship. It says, Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at that time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music. You shall fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, in symphony, with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Right? When you hear the music, bow down. right? It's interesting because the herald didn't ask for a vote here, did he? He told the people what was going to happen and how they were to respond. And if they didn't, they were dead. If you don't worship this, what is it? That's a matter of life and death. Worship it, you live. Don't, you die. He says, at the sound of the music, bow down, worship the image. And if not, you're dead. Now, for the people there, this wouldn't have been uncommon. You see, worshiping many gods and goddesses was common for the crowd that would have been there. So this command was easy to obey, especially in light of the consequences. Like, hey, makes sense to me. I like my life. I'm bowing down. Think of this as a false Billy Graham crusade. Because that's exactly what it was. It was a false Billy Graham crusade. You see, the difference between the believers of Jesus and the unbeliever isn't the presence of faith, because everyone lives by faith in something. The difference was the object of their faith, right? The crowd believed and feared what they heard about this image, and then they obeyed. But these three Hebrew men, what we'll see is that they believed in the commandment of God and they disobeyed. The object of their worship was different. The crowd had an impressionable faith that wasn't secure, but the Jews had a confident faith because of God's faithfulness to them. This assembly of worshipers helps us understand people who don't know Jesus, right? They blindly follow the crowd and build their lives on what is false and futile, right? Think about it. Any dead fish can swim downstream. Just what happens. They're only concerned with survival, and they'll do almost anything to escape danger and death, even to the point of selling themselves into slavery to men or to the empty myths that they promote. What's interesting to me is music has the power to grip human thoughts and emotions and transform people from being free agents into becoming puppets, don't they? Music is powerful. We should not underestimate it. William Coggrave wrote this, that music has the charm to soothe the savage beast, but music also has the power to release the savage in the beast. Music is powerful. Music has the potential to be an excellent tool or a devastating weapon. The guy, Chuck Colson, he said this: what's the difference between Christianity and other religions? Christianity is about position. All others is about imposition. How do we position ourselves? What do we worship? Where are we? We're here. We're positioned this. But all other religions say, worship me or. And that's what we see. False worship imposes an outward-only worship. What Jesus' purpose is an expression of love. Think about it. Think of it this way. Christianity is really Jesus, the groom, proposing to us, the bride. Expressing his love, demonstrating that love so that we would say yes. You see, you have a choice of who you will worship. And we need to have a heart like Daniel and his friends. Right? They chose to worship the God of the Bible, but what they didn't do is they didn't hate Babylon and the people that didn't worship the God of the Bible. But they loved them and they prayed for them and they served them. And that is an act of worship. That's when the music fades and I go out the doors, how I live out my worship. I live it out by the way God did. And then 8 through 12, what we're going to see is the heart of the redeemed as it reveals Jesus, right? It says, therefore, at the time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. Do they not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up? It's interesting to me, one of the things that worship reveals is that true worship is kind of freeing. But this false worship, it just seems a bit extreme. Worship this or get thrown in the fiery furnace, right? The consequence to the result doesn't seem to add up. That's just a bit harsh. like, do this or I'm going to burn you. You're kindling. It just doesn't seem right. But again, it's all revolved around this music. And we need to know that music remains a constant battlefield that can either motivate us to worship with intensity or to fall into idolatry. This band that they had was a band's band, right? It wasn't just like some, it wasn't some unpracticed, untalented group of musicians that just got together and played. This would be the band on The Voice. They could play anything, right? Have you ever noticed that? Anybody watch The Voice? That band can play everything. It's crazy. But what we need to do is we need to be wise about what music we take in, because there is always a Nebuchadnezzar that's going to strike up a band around you. So be careful with what you listen to. Our worship doesn't need to sound or look like the world. And that's one of the things I think that we've seen with this pandemic, is everything has been stripped away. Gone are, on the worship stage, the flashing lights and the smoke machines and the laser light shows. God brought it back down to the simplicity of worship, with talented men and women getting up and just simply leading us into the throne room of God, opening up the heavens so that we could see Jesus and we could fall down and cry out, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. You see, true worship has the power to deliver us, not just move us. Good music may move you or get you to tap your foot, but worship will get you to change your life. Isaiah 43, verse 1 and 2 says this, but now, thus says the Lord who created you, O Jacob, and who has formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And though the rivers, they shall not overthrow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. True worship reveals to us what? Jesus is our Emmanuel, that God will be with us. It stirs within us a faith to walk and to live differently, a faith that causes us to obey God regardless of our feelings. You ever notice that sometimes you just don't feel like following the Lord? Today was one of those instances. I decided that I'm going to get my mocha this morning. I didn't really have time to get breakfast, so I got a breakfast sandwich, and I ordered it on my app. Why? Because I didn't want to waste time. I just wanted to drive through the drive-thru at Starbucks, pick it up, and go. Wouldn't you know? So I entered the entrance by McDonald's. This other car illegally entered by the stock in a box. Speeds through, sees me coming, looks at me, gives me the stink eye, I'm sure. Couldn't see it. They had tinted windows, so they were doing something illegal. They had to have been. Cuts me off. Pulls right in front of me. I looked at Abby, wanted to say some choice words, and I thought to myself, I hope they pop a tire. Just after they leave the drive-thru. And wouldn't you know it, that their order took forever? I'm sure it was only 2 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity, right? Why? Because I was so furious that things didn't go the way that I wanted them to do. I didn't feel like following God at that moment. I wanted to run into them, push them out of the way, get my order, let them know what I thought about them. And then tell them, hey, why don't you come to church with me? Right? But sometimes we just don't feel like it. Here's this group of people. We don't know. Were they the same advisors that maybe were embarrassed by Daniel, who actually saved their life, that would bring the accusation? We don't know. But what we do know is how quickly they forgot what God had done and how God had saved their lives. You see, when Jesus is the object of your faith and your worship, you're not afraid of threats. You're not impressed by crowds, or you're not swayed by ceremonies. How will you know if your faith and worship are pure and real? Well, you'll know by your obedience. Will you obey the Lord and trust his work, and that he's going to work all things regardless of your circumstances? These three men knew the law of God that said, you shall have no other God before me. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. And they didn't. And it was what they worshiped that revealed their faith, the faith that was deep in their heart. What you worship reveals your heart. These men worshiped the God of the Bible and would not compromise. And the God of the Bible wouldn't let them down. The second thing that we're going to see is that what we worship really is revealing of the objects of our worship, right? In verses 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Notice that phrase I keeps coming up. Now, if you are ready at the time and you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from you, or from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. King Nebuchadnezzar made himself God. He worshiped himself. But the children of Israel worshiped the God of the Bible. Question for you, something to ponder. Where was Daniel? How come he wasn't brought in there? Was he bowing down? Was he worshiping? I doubt it. We don't know where he was. We have no idea. Most people believe that he was out on government business, doing something else. He probably wasn't there. I believe that this probably took place when Daniel was removed from the king's presence, because I think Daniel would have spoke some sense to the king. Like, really, king, you're going to do that? And we see that from his life. So here the king is. He says, you got to, bring these guys to me. What is he doing? He's throwing a temper tantrum. Right? He's like a 2-year-old. Why are you doing? I could just see him stamping his foot, pounding his hand. I've conquered so many kingdoms and so many nations, and nobody can beat me. But he couldn't overcome himself, could he? He couldn't overcome his pride. Proverbs 16:32. He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And that's what we see in King Nebuchadnezzar. He forgot that he'd called the God of these Hebrew children the God of all gods, the Lord of all kings, right? In chapter 2, verse 47. And arrogantly he asks, who is the God that will deliver you? He forgot that it's the same God that revealed his dreams would be the very God that would deliver them from his hands. And this is simply a claim that he is God himself, that there's no one greater than me. That's what he's saying. These 3 guys, they could have compromised and defended their disobedience pretty simply, couldn't they? They could have said, well, everybody else is doing it. Or, our office demands that we obey. Or maybe they could have used this one. We'll bow our knees, but not our hearts. How do you do that? Right? They might have said, we can do our people more good by being officers in the king's servant than by being ashes in the king's furnace. Legitimate excuses. But they would have simply been that, excuses. But the object of their faith didn't allow them to look for loopholes. They weren't looking for loopholes to get out. What they were looking for was what? God's presence to show up in the midst of. They're simply saying, God, we're going to worship you. We're going to follow you. We're going to live an obedient life. We're going to do what you say. And now we're going to give you the opportunity to be faithful to your word. And if you show up and you deliver us, great. If you let us burn, great, because we know that you're in charge. They were simply obeying God because they knew he knew what would be best and that he would do what was best for them. You see, faith rests on commands and promises, not arguments and explanations. That's what faith rests on. You see, times of adversity in our lives are times of opportunity. And that's how we should look at them, especially when it's persecution for our faith. Verse 16, they said this, you know what? We don't need to defend ourselves or God, for God will defend both. I love that. I'm not even going to waste my time answering the question, King. That's what they said. And then they said, we need to obey and trust God, and he'll do the rest. Isaiah chapter 12, verse 2, we read this. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For yea, the Lord is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. He is my strength and my what? My song. What does God put in our hearts? A new song. What is that? That's music. Interesting. It's got the power to save us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were men of faith, not men of presumption. They didn't assume God was just going to deliver them. They affirmed that he could deliver them, but if they would have presumed that he would and he didn't, what would have that done? Nothing really, but show that God is still sovereign and God is still in charge. They didn't know what God was going to do, did they? But they trusted in his faithfulness. So instead of presuming, they stated that their God could deliver them. And even if he didn't, he still would deliver them out of the king's presence. And because of that, they still wouldn't bow down before the king's image. That fiery furnace didn't bother them. They knew that what he was asking for was nothing more than a commercial faith that says this: we will obey God if he rewards us for what we're doing. Right? I'll obey God if you do what I ask. But you know what that is? That's Satan's philosophy, and it's been that way for eternity. Think about it. What did he say to Jesus in Matthew 4:9? He said, all these things I will give to you. Now, here's the commercial. All these things I'll give to you if you fall down and worship me. See the connection? It's been that way through eternity. What does the TV tell us? If you buy these things, you'll be satisfied. If you drive this car, if you have this job, if you make this amount of money, it's a commercial. It's just a big commercial to what? Elevate you as God and for you to worship yourself. And have you ever noticed that the images on TV are not the images that you purchase when you go there, especially when you go to a fast food restaurant? Have you ever noticed that the burgers don't look the same? It's like, what is this? I can't tell you how many people I've heard make this promise to God, trying to persuade him to heal them. God, if you just change my circumstances, then I'll give you my life. Then I'll follow you. Then I'll serve you. And they're trying to barter with God. And that's exactly what it is. It's bartering and not believing, not trusting, not saying, God, I don't know what's going on. And yeah, I don't like my current situation. Think about it. These guys did not want to be in Babylon. That wasn't what they grew up thinking. Hey, I want to be a eunuch in Babylon serving a king and worshiping false gods. No, they were ripped from their homes, drugged 700 miles, castrated, and set in the king's courts to serve him. And it was at that time that they said, I'm not going to compromise, because the object of their worship was the God of the Bible. And they didn't say, God, if you could just change my circumstances, then I'll worship you. They said, no, in the midst of my circumstances, I will worship you, and I would like you just to show up and show yourself faithful. Help me out here, God. Be with me. One of the things that we hear most common about this pandemic that we're in is that people are dying alone and loved ones can't be with their family members. And that's the tragedy. You see, when you're in a loving relationship with God, regardless of the circumstances, what do you want? You want the one that you love with you. And that's who God is. He is our God who is with us. God will always reward faith, but he doesn't always step in and perform extraordinary miracles. That doesn't mean he's not rewarding your faith. You see, not everybody who prays for healing will be, but God will always give them the strength to bear the pain and the grace to face the circumstances and the fear that they're with, because God will show up with them. These three Hebrew men believed that God could deliver them, but they would trust him even if he didn't. This is how faith is supposed to operate in our lives. Habakkuk 3, verse 17 through 19 says this: though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flocks may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. That's faith. You see, Nebuchadnezzar conquered countries, took riches, captured people, but he always allowed them to worship their gods. He was considered very liberal and generous in this. But what he said this, he said, guys, you can worship your gods, but I also want to add to your gods my God. Add to it. And you know what? Our enemy always says the exact same thing. You can go to church on Sunday, but worship me the rest of the week. Right? He gives you the freedom to worship God, hoping that you feel okay about bowing down to the idols in your life. He says, it's okay. Just do that. You can worship your God, but worship me too. These men worship the God of the Bible. And it reveals to us what? That God can deliver us. But yet, even if he doesn't, they said, we're not going to bow down. This isn't doubt of God's power to save them. It was submission to God's will concerning whether he intended to save them or not. You see, they didn't doubt God's ability. What they did is they submitted to his sovereignty. Hebrews 11:33 through 34. The halls of faith, right? It says this, who through faith subdued kings, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaping the edge of the sword, out of weaknesses were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight the armies of the aliens. You see, by faith, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego quenched what? The violence of the fires. We'll look at that next week. We know that they didn't burn because of their faith. But faith in what? Their faith wasn't in faith. Their faith was in the Father. Their faith was in Jesus, who would be with them in the midst of that fire. You see, when we pour out our requests to God and say, God, if you decide not to heal me or bring me the financial, relief that I need or save my business, doesn't matter. I will worship you anyway. All I want, God, is your will for my life. That's true faith. How I pray that we can learn this. How I pray that we will allow God to transform us. You see, when the government tries to control our conscience and tell us how to worship and who to obey, we need to be those who obey God rather than man, regardless of the cost. And then we need to love and pray and share the hope and love of Jesus Christ with the people that we disagree with. We need to serve them like Jesus. Why? Because that's a true act of worship.